Good evening and welcome to the stream. Tonight we're going to be going through chapter 21 of the book of Genesis. To do a real quick recap of last chapter, it was chapter 20. We saw Abraham making the same poor decision that he made previously, where when traveling through a land, he told the king or the pharaoh that Sarah was his sister instead of his wife, because he was worried that someone was going to kill him over Sarah. So not trusting in the Lord, Abraham made a poor decision. So that's where we ended last chapter. Now this chapter, we're going to go into some repercussions for the sin and the lack of faith, basically, in the Lord for Abraham and Sarah. We'll start with a quick prayer, and then we'll do the reading of the Word. Lord, just bless this Bible study, Lord. Just bless this time to go through your Word, Lord. Thank you for this time out of our busy schedules that we could just go through, read through the Word, and just pull things out that are going to be applicable in our lives today and going forward, Lord. Just bless this Bible study, and your will be done. In your name, amen. All right. Chapter 21 of the book of Genesis. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. And she also said, Who would have to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Sarah, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatsoever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar, and sent her away. And then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. And then she went and sat down across from him at the distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, Let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite of him and lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water, and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And it came to pass at the time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land which you have dwelt. And Abraham said, I will swear. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of the well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor I had heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham sent 7 ewe lambs of the flocks by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham what the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which are set by themselves. And he said, You will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that I may be witness that I have dug this well. Therefore he called the place Beersheba, because the two of them swore an oath there. And thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. So that's chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. So we'll start out right in the beginning. So right away we see the coming what is basically the promise of Abraham and Sarah, that they would have a son. So Abraham and Sarah finally have this son. Now, it took 25 years for the son that was promised to arrive. So 25 years is a long time to wait. I mean, 25 years is 25 years. But finally, at the age of 100 and Sarah's almost 90, this promise in Isaac has arrived, basically. Sometimes you get concerned with God and his promises and his plans for us. And I like to think of Jeremiah 29:11 tells us, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Our future is in God's hands." Plans to give you a hope and a future. So our future is in God's hands. He knows what's going to happen. He already knows the plan for our lives, and we need to trust in that we trust the Lord and what he's doing. Again, that's Jeremiah 29:11 tells us that. Going down to verse 3, and Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him Isaac. Now, Isaac means laughter, and basically, God has him name the son Laughter, and this is almost like a response to, if you remember previously, when Sarah overheard the Lord and Abraham speaking outside the tent. She laughed when God promised Abraham that he'd have this son. She laughed in disbelief. So now, they're naming the son that they actually had, Isaac, Laughter. So this basically to remind Sarah each time she calls out to Isaac, a remembrance of her unbelief, but also just a remembrance of how God turns disbelief into joy, right? Because God still came through and provided this son for Sarah and Abraham, regardless of Sarah's unbelief. David Guzik writes this about Isaac. Isaac becomes a wonderful type or picture of Jesus, and he says both were specially promised sons. So Jesus is the son of God, and Isaac the son of Abraham. Both were born after a period of delay. So remember, everyone's been waiting for Jesus the Messiah to come along. Abraham's been waiting years and years for Isaac to come along. Both mothers were assured by God's own omnipotence. So the mothers knew that they'd be having these childs. Who was told, right? Mary was told by God that she'd be having this child, or by the angel, and Sarah was told by God she'd be having this child. Both were given names rich with meaning before they were born. Both births occurred at God's appointed time. Both births were miraculous, and both births were accompanied by joy. So that's kind of the correlation between Isaac and Jesus. Basically, Isaac is a symbolization of Jesus, future on. Going down, we're going to go down to verse 9. So at this point, Isaac's being weaned. So Isaac is about a few years old. And now they have this great feast. And during this great feast, we have Ishmael, who's about 15 years older than Isaac at this point. So Isaac's maybe 2 or 3, and Ishmael's probably 17 or 18 at this time. And he's basically teasing or making fun of Isaac. Now, how severe, how bad, we don't really know. I mean, a 17-year-old and a 3 or 4-year-old, I mean, obviously there's going to be some between these brothers, but Sarah basically takes this to heart, and Sarah's like, I want Ishmael gone. David Guzik breaks this down a little further, and I enjoy this. Now, he breaks it down even to the level of where we correlate with the New Testament. David Guzik says, "Notice the conflict came from Ishmael unto Isaac. Ishmael was the one scoffing at Isaac. Galatians 4:22-29 describes for us as a spiritual application of this conflict between Isaac, who was the son born of the promise, and Ishmael, son born of the flesh." So again, Ishmael is the son born of the flesh, and Isaac's the son born of the promise. The promise that God promised that they would have this son, and then Ishmael was the flesh, in that Sarah and Abraham got together and of their own doing created Ishmael, basically, by giving Hagar to Abraham to have the child. David Guzik goes on to write, in Galatians 4, the Jewish legalists who troubled the Galatians protested that they were the children of Abraham and thus blessed. Paul admitted they were children of Abraham, but they were like Ishmael, not Isaac. The legalists claimed Abraham as their father. Paul asked who their mother was, Hagar or Sarah. Ishmael was born of a slave and born according to flesh. Isaac was born of a free woman and born according to the promise. Even so, the legalists promoted a relationship with God based in bondage and according to the flesh. The true gospel of grace offers liberty in Jesus Christ that is a promise received by faith. So again, the grace, right? God's grace to us and everything is the representation of Isaac, right? That God's promise and his mercifulness and his grace is Isaac. And then what we try to do in our own flesh, basically trying to keep the law and things like that, is a symbolization of Ishmael. We'll go down to verse 12. So now Abraham loves Ishmael. I think sometimes if you've grown up in a church, Ishmael's kind of always seemed like a different character that had to go away for some, just had to be cast out. But this is Abraham's son who Abraham loved. And Abraham loves Ishmael immensely. And now Sarah is basically saying Ishmael and Hagar have to go. Warren Risby does a great job. He writes this: it was grievous for Abraham to say goodbye to his son, but this was God's command and he had to obey. Little did he realize that his obedience was preparation for an even greater test when he would have to put Isaac on the altar. The word translated grievous means to shake violently like curtains blowing in the wind. Abraham was deeply moved within and perhaps somewhat displeased at this turn of events. So obviously Abraham is really upset about having to send off Ishmael and Hagar. Probably more Ishmael at this point, but Hagar as well. David Guzik writes, perhaps Abraham did not want to give up Ishmael because he was a sort of backup plan. If something should happen to Isaac, there would always be Ishmael. God did not want Abraham to trust in a backup son or a backup plan. God wanted Abraham to trust in him. So that's kind of just another take on it. Maybe Abraham was like, well, now I have two sons. If anything happens to Isaac, I always have Ishmael. John Wesley writes, and this thing was grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. It grieved him that Ishmael had given such provocation, and it more grieved him that Sarah insisted upon this punishment. So this is just Abraham kind of being almost caught in this situation that he was a part of and created, but it's something that he really doesn't want to do. He's basically having his hand forced, and again he's praying to the Lord, and the Lord basically tells him, yes, you need to listen to Sarah and you need to send away Ishmael. And again, Ishmael is a representation of the flesh, so basically Abraham is cutting off the flesh at this point. Now Abraham's going to send him off. If we go down to verse 15, Abraham's going to send him off in water in the skin. Verse 14. Took bread in the skin of the water and put it on her shoulder. So just a bread in the skin of water. Now, Abraham was a wealthy man, and he could certainly afford to give them more supplies. But what Abraham realized was, as he's sending them off to this wilderness, that without God's help, they're not going to make it. Now, God had already made this promise about Ishmael, that he had many descendants, and he'd be a great leader. Not a great leader, but a leader amongst many people. So Abraham is basically putting his trust in God, that God's going to take care of him at this point. Now, obviously Hagar and Ishmael run into some issues out here in the wilderness, and basically Ishmael's dying and Hagar walks away because she doesn't want to hear Ishmael die. So she leaves Ishmael and she goes a bow shot away so she doesn't hear him die, and then she lifts up her voice and weeps, and then Ishmael is lifting up his voice, and now God hears the voice of the lad, or of Ishmael. Guzik writes, Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. As God protected and preserved them out in the desert, he answered them by hearing the voice of the lad. God showed special favor to Ishmael because he was a descendant of Abraham. I will make him a great nation. The descendants of Ishmael become the Arabic people. So obviously God had a plan for Ishmael. I think that gets lost a lot of times in a lot of different teachings and things like that, is that, Ishmael is always kind of considered, the cast off, but in reality, God cared for Ishmael. God had a plan for Ishmael. Matthew Henry writes, In this distress, God graciously appeared for their relief. He heard the voice of the lad. We read not a word of what he said, but his sighs and groans in the calamitous state, cried aloud in the ears of mercy. An angel was sent to comfort Hagar. It was not the first time that she had met with God's comforts in the wilderness. She had thankfully acknowledged the former kind visit which God made in such a case, and therefore God now visited her again. So we remember when Hagar originally left and went to the desert, right? And then God told her to go back to have Ishmael, and that was the original issue. And now she's back in basically the same place, and God hears her cries. Now, after doing all this, we're going to go down and we're going to see this treaty. We're going to have a treaty between Abimelech and Abraham. And it's basically someone from the Philistines area, and he's coming over with somebody to basically create this treaty with Abraham. David Guzik writes, this is probably not the same Abimelech from Genesis 20. Abimelech was a title of a ruler among the Canaanites, not a specific name. Now, Abimelech is respectful to Abraham because he knows that Abraham's a man of God, so he's very careful with this basically this treaty. Now, Abraham's older at this point. Abraham's been through a lot. He's old, he's respectful to Abimelech, but at the same time, he's strong enough to call Abimelech out when this well thing where they're fighting over this well comes to pass. But also Abraham goes and takes the step of offering these animals kind of for a covenant with Abimelech to have this peace deal. So Abraham has obviously shown his maturity, especially from earlier when he was younger, which we saw a lot of mistakes from Abraham. But now he's showing some maturity and he makes this covenant. And at the end of this covenant, Abraham plants this tree in Beersheba, and he calls it the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. David Guzik writes, even through this time of conflict in his family and amongst his neighbors, Abraham kept a real, live walk with God. Conflict can drive us away from God, but we should not allow it to push us closer to him. So that's kind of the recap of chapter 21. And again, chapter 21 is going to be, chapter 21 is basically mostly about Hagar and Ishmael leaving Abraham and Sarah. So now at this point we have Sarah and Abraham, and there's no second wife, right? There's no second son in Ishmael. So we basically have this happy family that's basically, okay, great, everything's good now. We're going to have a happy family. Everything's going to be great. But life has its seasons. And although Abraham might right now feel good about the season he's going to be in, life is full of different seasons. And Warren Wisby writes this. He says, the Christian life is a land of hills and valleys, said the Scottish preacher George Morrison, basing his words on Deuteronomy 11:11. Solomon expressed the same idea when he wrote in Ecclesiastes 3:4 that there is a time of weeping, there is a time of laughing. Heaven is a place of unending joy, hell is a place of unending suffering. But while we are here on earth, we must expect both joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. You cannot have hills without valleys. This is especially true of the family life. For the same people who bring us joy also bring us sorrow. So, and thinking to the future, right, we know that at this point, Abraham's going to go through next chapter, and Abraham's going to be faced with sacrificing his son Isaac, right? And it's pretty much, I would say, one of the most controversial chapters in the Old Testament, in Abraham taking his son up to the top of Mount Moriah to sacrifice Isaac. But I think about Abraham's faith and why he is the father of faith, and part of me goes to this quote, and this is from Corrie ten Boom, and she's a Holocaust survivor, someone who dealt with pretty awful things. Her sister died in the camps, and she was basically, her book is amazing, but she says, never be afraid to trust an unknown future to an unknown God. And I think that's just important for us to remember as Christians as we go through our daily walks, is just our trust in God and our faith in what God is doing is everything. So I'm going to end there. So I don't see any questions, but say hello. So thank you for joining. We'll close this out with a word of prayer. Lord Jesus, just thank you for this time, Lord. Thank you for this time to just go through your word and just listen to this amazing story, Lord, about Abraham, the father of faith, and just about, he wasn't a perfect person, Lord, but the way you used him and the way he leaned on you throughout his life, Lord, it's an example for all of us, Lord, that you are a known God, Lord. Regardless of how we stress and concern ourselves with the future, we know who you are, Lord, and what you're doing in our lives, and our lives are in your hands. Lord, bless us today. Bless us until we meet again tomorrow night. In your precious name, amen.